By way of okay. So by way of introduction, I'd like to say this is a work in progress. It's been released to policymakers, but I haven't released it in an academic sense yet, but I plan to do so. And it builds on not only a practical interest in how you do better skills planning, but also my deep analytical interest in the dynamics of labour market segmentation. So there are two motivations. The New South Wales government approached Sydney Uni about 4 years ago saying they wanted to develop a better approach to skills planning. In particular, they wanted to get a better matching of labour supply and labour demand. And I led a 4-year study working with them. This was one aspect of a larger project on applying data science to try and get a better handle on how the vocational education system in New South Wales was evolving, and most of the work was done in developing a predictive model for that. This work was the kind of icing on the cake, and it was, if you like, blue sky research to try and get them to think a bit more broadly, not just patch up what they've got, but to try and get them to think more broadly. And our approach was basically saying the idea of focusing on supply and demand and filling the gap is actually not a very helpful way of thinking. We shouldn't be trying to predict the future. The future is very dynamic. What we can do is deepen the capacity to adapt more effectively. And so when you'll see throughout this whole presentation, the motivation is not so much to fill the gap between supply and demand, it's rather to build an adaptive capacity both within the system and within citizens. The second motivation for the study is to build on and contribute to the analytical tradition that's known as labour market segmentation. So I'll just take you, I've been told I've got 45 minutes, and I'll try and be disciplined. I'll try and make it a bit shorter than that because I think discussion is better than having a long lecture. But I'll basically take you through the different approaches to skills planning and why I don't think they're very helpful. Note that in trying to build a better way of thinking about these issues, I'm drawing on the scholarly debates around labour market segmentation. The end point of those introductory ideas is that if we're not going to have a gap analysis, then we've really got to build adaptive capacity. But then how do you define the domains of adaptation? And this is where we use insights from labour market segmentation to do that. And then I finish up by noting what are the implications for skills planning. So let's start off, and I'll start off provocatively. I'm a policy researcher. I'm based in a university, but I've built my career around taking the scholarly techniques into the applied domain. And I've done quite a bit of work advising governments on skills planning. And a thing that I am now quite forthright about is that I think most ways of thinking about skills planning are pretty unhelpful. There's a real dead end with this linear gap analysis. Libraries are littered with studies that have been done where people say, what are the skills of the future that we need, mapping what those are, then getting data on what the nature of labour supply is, finding the gap and saying, therefore, we've got to train people up. This sentiment continues to this day, and it's consistently proved unhelpful. The reaction against that has been to say, well, what we've got to do is have the ultra flexible workforce and give them 21st century skills that give them generic capabilities like problem solving, collaboration and creativity, and then top up those generic skills with micro credentials. This is an equally unhelpful narrative because that's not the way in which skills and expertise is built. And I think this does a lot of damage. And Stephanie and I did a paper for UNESCO last year, which elaborated the flaws with that way of thinking in some detail. So a more helpful way of thinking is that we've got to move away from the idea of workforce planning and instead move towards the idea of planning for workforce development. So that means you plan for building adaptive capacity. And so you need institutions that can help manage an unknown future, and you need to give individuals the capacity to respond to the unknown. So then the key question, the key analytical question then becomes, how are domains of adaptivity defined? Now, because this is a scholarly audience, I thought I'd give you a bit of background to the analytical tradition I'm drawing on to help answer that question. And I'm firmly within the labour market segmentation tradition of labour market research. And in a nutshell, there are deep tributaries to this analytical tradition. So if you go back to the 19th century, people like John Stuart Mill and Cairns made the simple but quite profound observation that the market for labour was not like the market for standard commodities. It was structured into non-competing groups, and that's where you get the notion of segments. There are segments that within them there is competition, but between them there is often no competition at all. In the 20th century, these ideas were developed most profoundly around the Cambridge Labour Market School of Segmentation, particularly Rubery and Wilkinson. But in more recent times, there have been quite sophisticated analyses from particularly Marxian political economy, especially Howard Botwinick. And in a nutshell, this group argues that if you want to understand how labour markets are segmented, you've got to look at what they call, you've got to move beyond the quantity theory of competition. In a capitalist economy, competition is highly uneven. It's usually a competition to try and corner monopolies or get a competitive advantage by being first players in key markets. And what capitalist competition does is set lower limits to how far labour can be degraded. And that's set by the dynamics around the reserve army of labour. And the upper limits of labour market structure are set by the prevailing rate of profit in the leading sectors of capital. That creates the space within which labour markets evolve, and the way in which they are shaped is determined by industrial relations, the state and culture. So if you like, market forces set the upper and lower bounds, political and social forces actually shape what prevails. The third literature that's elaborated on that dynamic is that looks at the dynamics around occupational and internal labour markets. And I think the most useful work in that area has been done by Marsden. And then the fourth literature I look at are the taxonomies of the content of different labour market segments done by people like Dunlop, Goldthorpe and Osh. And most recently, there's been work done on the changes in skills as people move between occupations within different segments. So I've belted through a lot of literature there, but that's the kind of material I'm drawing down on, and I can refer back to it in questions if you're interested. Just to elaborate on what some of the most influential thinking is that's shaped my analysis, John Dunlop was part of what was known as the neoclassical realists who came out of the Second World War in the US. And they developed the idea of occupational internal labour markets. And this is the way Dunlop said the US workforce was stratified in the 50s and 60s. And you'll see the beauty of a labour market segmentation approach is that it doesn't just look at industries or occupations or employment form or size, it brings them all together. And so the categories are quite untidy from a statistical point of view, but that's the way the labour market works. It is untidy. It's not it doesn't conform to mutually exclusive categories. It's ensembles. And you'll see in my analysis, we use modern data science to help quantify the different forms. Goldthorpe in the 80s developed his well-known class categories, which once again combine notions of skill level, occupation, industry, and ownership. And his concepts were taken further by a Swiss researcher called Osh, and he brings together both the size of the employer and the logic of the skill that is involved. So, like I say, I'm belting through this pretty quickly, but can come back to it if you like. It's this idea of understanding labour markets as segmented that's absolutely crucial for getting a handle on what we've got to think about when we're thinking about helping people navigate an uncertain future in terms of their skills requirements. So what was the research design that I pursued, or we pursued, to illuminate these issues? And our starting point, we thought, because we're doing this for a policy audience, we would start with where policy currently starts, and that's a linear view of flows of educational and occupational progression. And so we're saying, well, the policy assumes these linear flows. What actually happens in reality? And we used a longitudinal data set which tracked 8,000 workers over 5 years. And we examined how they actually moved through the labour market. And then we clustered those flows to get a sense of what segmentation is currently like. So this is the starting point in Australia. And I think this should be pretty familiar to a South African audience, because I think key parts of the South African training system drew on parts of the Australian system. And you will note that, and I started off my research career looking at the engineering sector. In Australia, the Metal Workers Union was very influential in restructuring both our wages system and our training system. And they said they wanted to move away from a world in which trades workers had privileged power in the labour market, and they wanted to open up the skills of trades workers so that trades assistants and the like could move in there, and they wanted to have a world where trades workers could become engineering technicians and move on to be degree qualified engineers. This was the so-called award restructuring process, which was about building career paths for people over their lives. This principle for restructuring qualifications and wage arrangements pervaded the labour market. So whilst it was originally mapped out in engineering, similar ideas were put together in the agricultural sector, in the care sector, and in the finance sector. And in a research project that Lisa Wheelahan and I ran over a 3-year period, we looked at these 4 contrasting sectors to see what actually happens in terms of how do people, that's what the theory is. You can start off as a trades assistant through your competency-based training, do work that was previously trades-based, and then over time move on to paraprofessional work, and then ultimately onto professional work. Nice story. In fact, as a union delegate in the 80s and early 90s, I argued very strongly for supporting reforms along this line. But as you'll see in my presentation, this is not the way in which the world works. Policy has a very clear framing, but this framing is not a very good way of understanding reality. And the way we got a handle on reality was using a longitudinal data set that we built up over a 6-year period. This was a large study supported by both the key unions in Australia and the Australian Research Council, which is like your Human Sciences Research Council. And we tracked 8,000 workers over 6 years. There's the drop-off rate. That's actually a very low drop-off rate for a longitudinal study, and it was a sign of how loyal our participants were. If you want more details on that, it nearly ruined us as a research group, because we expected a far higher dropout rate, and we chewed up most of the money collecting the data. We'd expected a dropout rate of 50%, because when you've got to collect thousands of more data points, it costs a lot of money. So what did that data actually reveal? And this is a fairly typical Schenke diagram, which shows what happens to people who were general sales assistants. So with our data, we could break down flows of people to the 4-digit level, and there are over 420 different occupations. And this is just looking at one of those 420 occupations. So this is a very fine level of disaggregation, and this is sales assistants. and you'll see a big chunk of them stay on as sales assistants, but over each year they move into different occupations. And so our analytical question was, we, in a simple way, we could look at, and I'm a kind of data junkie, I did look at, I looked at 420 of these Sankey diagrams, and we used modern methods of cluster analysis to say, how can you find common patterns in these flows across 420 different occupational groups? This was done by my colleagues, Bala Rajaratnam, Stephen Tierney and Jay Yin. So for them, the method was clustering by transition volume. This was then used to generate a transition matrix. They converted the transition matrix to an affinity matrix, and this was used to generate a number of clusters. After a bit of toing and froing and after 3 iterations, we ultimately arrived at 42 different clusters. So just to reiterate, for each occupation, you could say, starting in 2006, you've got all your occupations ranked up 1 to 420, and you can have those Sankey diagrams, and you can use modern cluster analysis to figure out where are the commonalities in those kind of flows. And that's what our clustering did. So just to give you some examples of some typical clusters, Cluster 16 was registered nurses, no big surprises there. It's a strong occupational labour market, has registered nurses, nurse managers, nurse educators. They sometimes move across to be health and welfare service managers. That's what you would expect with a strong, coherent occupational labour market. The educators, once again, is similar. There's a lot of movement between school teachers into school principals, or specialised general teachers becoming specialised teachers, and sometimes teachers moving out to be welfare and recreational community arts workers. So they're kind of classic occupational labour markets. Other flows were in the ICT sector, which were more industry-based, and this is where people could start off lower down and would then move up into ICT management or call centre management roles, but would start off lower down in as ICT trainers, or even start off lower in life as accommodation and hospitality managers, but then move up into higher echelons of the ICT sector. When I eyeballed these clusters, those kind of ones made sense. The first 2 are classic examples of occupational labour markets. Cluster 39 is a kind of classic example of an industry labour market. But then I noticed there were these other clusters, cluster 42, cluster 33 and cluster 4, which made no real sense to me. You had assistants in nursing or personal care attendants, police, real estate agents, car salespeople. You had education aides, special care workers, baristas. And as I looked at it, I thought, this is the data science producing junk, because it's well known that sometimes you can use an advanced algorithm and it produces a cluster that doesn't make much sense. But then I thought about it a little further, and this is the main finding we found empirically, that when you cluster like this, you can actually see people don't just start off as a care worker and stay as a care worker. They actually move more between clerical work, customer service work, and personal care work. And this is, you'll start to see, this is where we think that we've got to broaden our way of thinking about occupations. It's not just the classic ones that you see in the standard occupational categories, it's the flows between these related areas of modern service work that we think is key, and I'll outline what those categories are. You can visualise what these flows are by using optimal matching analysis. So if we're in the health and care sector, you can break that down into, if people started off as a registered nurse, where did they end up? This is based on another longitudinal data set, the Household Income and Labour Dynamics of Australia data set. And this is the flows of nurses over 10 years. So if you started off as a nurse, and nurses, by the way, are grey, a big chunk of them remained as nurses, or if they didn't, they went back to higher ed. So the yellow is higher ed. So you'll see there's a massive grey there, with basically people moving between the occupation and education. The support staff have a very different trajectory, however, and this is where you'll see the carer classification. Some of them stayed carers all the way through, not nearly as many as the nurses, but then they bounce around all over the place between other non-manual work, other manual work, unemployment, out of the labour force. That's classic horizontal churn. So with the nurses in an occupational labour market, huge stability, even over a 10-year period. For the support workers, however, they are moving into and out of the care area. We did the same in agriculture. If you look at farmers who were deemed as farmers or farm managers, they're essentially moving between continuing farm work and moving into and out of education. The labourers in agriculture, however, are all over the place. They're not going into education, they're bouncing around between technical and trades work, machinery operator work, labouring work, unemployment, and not in the labour force. So how do you configure these clusters? So as you can imagine, as a labour market researcher, I found this pretty confronting, because it doesn't neatly fall into the categories of occupational labour markets and internal labour markets, and what Bosch calls external labour markets, which are unstructured external labour markets. So I started off by saying, well, let's start, some occupations do fit that category. And then I showed you the nurses in that case. And there are some unskilled, what you could call almost homogenous labour, which is an external unstructured labour market. But I said there's another way of, another axis on which you can look at this, and that is skill level. So there's a degree of structuration in the labour market, and then there's the level of skill. And in the Australian and New Zealand standard classification of occupations, there's a hierarchy of skills levels. That you'll be familiar with these. This hierarchy of skills levels aligns with the different qualifications levels. You can have a qualification level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and so on. So what I did is took the 42 clusters that were generated by the machine learning, and can I apologise for the user hostility of this PowerPoint? I usually do try and use big font, but I am conveying information from 42 clusters. And what I did is, there's the structuration axis. So that's the well-defined occupational labour markets at one level, and then the unstructured external labour markets at the other. In between are loosely defined occupational labour markets, and then semi-structured external labour markets. And there's the skill levels. So skill level 5 is the least skilled, skill level 1 is the highest, the professional level. And so with this grid, you can see there are your classic occupations and trades. So well structured at the high and middle levels. This is your classic homogenous labour, unstructured, low skill. But you've then got these other categories of semi-structured, medium range skilled occupations. And so that leads to our first major finding. There are 5 different types of segmented flows: classic professional and trades-based labour markets, managerial domain expert flows, particularly around engineering, loose occupational labour markets based in the creative industries. Then you've got the blue collar workforce segmented 3 ways between trades, vertical limited movement intermediates, and then homogenous labour. And then most interestingly, you've got the semi-structured external labour markets in contemporary service support work. And there are 7 different flows of care, clerical, and customer service. And that can be visualised like this. This is the way in which, and this is looking at flows over a 6-year period. So with most of the workforce fell within these 42 clusters. I think in the cluster analysis, we ended up using, I think it was about 85%. So this is accounting for about 85% of the flows. And you'll see, these are the, remember I showed you the example of nurses. That's what the nurses, once a nurse, essentially always a nurse by and large. These are those flows where you would find professional engineers moving into management, or ICT experts moving into management, or teachers and moving into education management. These are the trades, and there's kind of horizontal flows within the trades, not vertical flows. And then within the blue collar workforce, there's also the generic labour, or the homogenous, relatively unskilled labour. This is people moving around either in primary or rural labour markets, or those in urban blue collar labour markets. And then you've got the plant and machine operators. You've got their drivers and stores workers, construction plant operators, or other machinery operators. The most interesting thing analytically was this group here. This is rethinking service work. So people aren't just care workers or clerical workers or customer service workers. There are 7 different flows, with some of them starting from relatively low and going to middle range, and some of them starting middle range and going higher. And you can visualize the occupational significance of these. So there you can see the service support workers are taking up about 1/3 of the workforce, but you'll see the professional managerial flows are around 1/5 of the workforce. And the pure professionals, that's mainly nurses and some teachers, and then you've got some senior execs. The blue collar workforce breaks out in 3 ways: trades, plant and machine operators, and then entry level. You can look at this there are different sub-segments within those. So in the professionals, for example, that group there is mainly nurses. That group there is specialised teachers. This group of professional managerial flows is mainly teachers flowing into headmaster roles and the like. And then, unsurprisingly, there's a strong gender dimension to this. So when you're looking at the blue collar area, the trades are overwhelmingly male, as are the technical and physical operators. At the homogenous labour end, there's more women. Unsurprisingly, service support workers are primarily women. Amongst professionals who stay professionals, that's mainly women, and that's especially nurses. And on the other side, you've mainly got males dominating the senior exec and the professional managerial flows. So what are the implications of this for skills planning? We need to engage with the reality of labour market segmentation and break with both linear thinking and wishful thinking. So the linear thinking is that gap analysis, and the wishful thinking is the 21st century skills and micro-credentials. And it leads to a paradox that, and this is something that we've written about extensively for the New South Wales government in another research paper. If you want to build up those specialised domains of expertise, or if you want to get those generic skills of problem solving and the like, you've got to have a specialised domain of expertise. And we actually argue that when thinking about that, don't think about it just being narrow. So if you're looking at those care workers, you've then got to look at, don't train them just to be a care worker or just a clerical worker or just a sales worker. Give them a core skill there, but note the adjacent occupations. And we think that's the way in which you can get to this notion of adaptive capacity. It's not just training in one specialised area and out of that getting a generic skill of problem solving in the area of, say, modern service support work. Get a core skill, say, in care, but then train them up in adjacent areas around clerical and sales. So what's the conclusion then? The reality of labour market segmentation continues, but we've got to recognise there's no symmetry between those segments, identified 5 different types. So there are clear challenges for each of the different segments. The future of the professions and the future of the trades is a perennial question. And the key issue here, I think, is the managerialisation of professional flows. AI gets a lot of talk in terms of transformation of the professions, but I think from a sociological point of view, it's the managerialisation of the professions which is just as significant as the AI challenge. And there continues to be a divergence between blue and white collar work. We've heard about, you know, the kind of merging and the destruction of occupations more generally, but I showed you the clusterings between blue collar work and white collar work continue to be quite distinctive. When we're thinking about the service area, we should be thinking about care, clerical and customer service flows, or what we call vocational streams. And when we think about blue collar work, we've got to recognise the continuity of deep segmentation that goes back in countries like Australia and South Africa, with their traditions in European labour markets. That distinction between the trades, the process work and the labouring work continues even into modern times. And so if we're interested in skills planning, then these are the kind of issues we've got to take into account. And we think it's far better to have a debate around what are the domains of vocations, what are the modern vocational streams we should be nurturing. And I've outlined empirically how you could start to map out what they are. But this is just an analytical exercise. To build up those vocational streams, you also need to have communities of trust, which involves both employers, unions, education authorities, getting together and saying, how do we define these domains and how do we develop them in a way that can benefit both the workforce and employers? Now, for those of you who are interested, we did some comparative analysis. Similar dynamics have been identified in German research, and similar dynamics have been identified in Danish research, particularly that notion of clerical, customer and sales work. But I won't bore you with the gory details there. I've spoken for the best part of 40 minutes and happy to take questions.
Thanks so much, John. That was really, really interesting and really helpful. A really exemplary balance of really analytic and conceptual work with really robust and practical implications for policy. So I think I really want to thank you so much for that presentation. We do have some questions in the Q&A already. And I also want to remind participants that you can write questions in the chats. We have a couple of comments also. We had a comment from Glenn Fisher, who is spent many years in South Africa in our skill system, who said he couldn't agree more on the need to focus on adaptive capabilities rather than planning for some unpredictable future. And Gavin Moody from Australia and Canada, who says labour market forecasting was invented to give astrology a good name. But I'm going to move from the chat to the Q&A, and both of the questions that we have in the Q&A so far are related to the automation issue, which you did point out, John, and I thought that your point about managerial changes to professional work being just as or more significant, it's such a great and really important point. But we do have two questions on technology. The one is, how does your presentation, or presumably your analysis, align with a disruptive economy where robots seem to be taking menial jobs in motor manufacturing factories? And then the second question is, what is the evidence for a fourth industrial revolution? So those are two questions on the automation issue. I've got another question, which is unrelated to that. Do you want to take the questions in groups, or shall I chuck a bunch of questions at you?
Yep.
Shall I give you the third question? So
Yep.
the third question is, How would this clustering impact on the way in which occupational classification systems reflect occupations? John, one of the reasons that we were so interested in your work is because we at Real have been doing a lot of work trying to find ways of getting our occupational classification system to relate to our qualification system when it doesn't particularly relate to occupations in our labor market. So I think, you know, that's why there's a lot of interest in these issues, because we've spent a lot of energy trying to develop these tools which are supposed to help us in doing skills planning, and they don't seem to be doing such a great job. I just do want to remind everyone that if you want to speak, it's always lovely to hear other voices. So if you want to raise your hand, then we can give you speaking rights, and that'll be really great if people want to do that, as well as adding questions in the Q&A. But I'll hand it back to you now, John, for those 3 questions, just to get us started.
Sure. So the first one, as I understood it, was about what are the implications of this analysis for robots taking over jobs, particularly the more menial work. And I think I might just take you back to the share screen. So you can kind of quantify that. The automation basically picks up routine work. And so you see that will be most acute in some of this work here, the kind of homogeneous labour area, but even there are limitations to how far it can go in terms of taking them away altogether. There'll be some of it in the physical area, particularly in the driver area. But once again, I think the moral panic around AI is overstated. I think it will change it's more likely to have a bigger impact on changing the character of the work as opposed to eliminating it altogether. And for me, that feeds into the overall argument that I'm putting forward. There's been talk literally for a decade, for a century, about the end of blue-collar work. But when you look at our visualisation, there's still a bucket load. In Australia, it's an advanced economy, but there's still a bucket load of blue-collar work there. I mean, you're looking at, well over 20%. And I think what you're going to see is a change in the character of this, not its elimination altogether. And I think that's the key issue to watch. Yes, there will be some shedding, but it's not the end of the story by any means. In terms of evidence for the 4th Industrial Revolution, just by coincidence, I'm actually putting a course together on the 4th Industrial Revolution, so I could talk about that for the rest of the night if you want to, but I won't go there. What I would simply say is, if we're going to grapple with the challenges that's putting forward, and there are 3 dimensions to it. The first dimension is, and can I say it's massively, that once again, it's massively overstated too. If you want to understand an industrial revolution, there are 4 dimensions to it: the power dimension, the conversion dimension, the transmission dimension, and the control dimension. The power dimension you see with the rise of renewable energy, and in many ways that will probably create as many jobs as it destroys. So our current energy systems are very capital intensive. Renewables actually create quite some strong demand. If we look at systems of conversion, yes, there will be, and that was going back to the previous question, technology will in some cases displace labour, but I think the more important thing about the dynamics of conversion are related to the character of the work as opposed to the absolute number of jobs. The transmission of knowledge, and in any industrial revolution, there's a big change in the way things are transmitted around it. First of all, it was canals, then it was railways. Now with the internet, it's the flow of information. Once again, this can be as big a source of jobs and activity as the elimination of them. And the question of control and the impact of control in shaping an industrial revolution, once again, that's an open question. If you come out of the American tradition, you use the capacity for changing control systems to try and eliminate labour. If you come out of the European tradition, you use it to augment labour and its skill. So what is the evidence for fourth industrial revolution? I think there are strong indicators of it there, but I don't think it should be the source of moral panic. It's the issue of how the character of all of those changes is handled and how the gains that come out of that are distributed. They're the bigger questions, not the actual revolution itself. Now, the third question about how would this clustering impact on occupational and qualification classifications, that's probably the key question for the night. And that's been the issue that's been driving my analysis and the analysis of the group I've been working with. I've worked with Lisa Wheelerhan over many years, and I think you've got a similar problem in South Africa. In Australia, we have had a plethora of highly specialised occupations which have and qualifications which are anchored in the competency-based training system. And what I'm striving to do here is say, well, what are the domains of expertise? That's what we're trying to map out here. How does labour flow in ways where there are adjacent domains of expertise? And I'm not sure if you've got it in your IR system. I know your IR system did bring in parts of the Australian system of arbitration, but, and I'm not saying this is policy in Australia, but my long-term aim with this stuff is we have what's known as a review process. Our awards are reviewed every year. Awards are instruments for regulating labour standards, and they're defined both on an industry basis and an occupational basis. And we're now down to 122 awards. And what I would see this research is saying, well, let's think about what are the categories that should inform the domains for defining what is a area for labour market standards. And so it's quite ambitious in that regard. I think it does provide a different way of thinking about these issues. But that's why I said this is not simply an analytical act. Like, I've shown you what you can do empirically, but how you would actually agree on those categories is something that's got to be socially and politically determined. Right, so if I just give you a concrete example again, right, let me share the screen. So if we were going to think about what are the domains for qualifications, I'd be broadening it out. So I'd be saying, let's think of the domain of contemporary intermediate and lower level service work, and there'd be specialised areas of care, clerical and customer service. But in defining the quals, you'd actually say, how do we have, say, a core around each of those? But if somebody did say a Cert 2 or a Cert 3 in care, in doing that, how would they also get adjacent skills in clerical and customer service? We've done work in the agricultural sector in Australia, and we found at this level, you can start to group these classifications together in what we call rural operations. And rural operations brings together, animal and land husbandry, basic hydraulics, basic machine maintenance, and that can straddle construction, mining, local government, agricultural work. And we've written this stuff up. We call it a Certificate 2 and a Certificate 3 in rural ops. And that then gives people the ability to move a lot more flexibly within these domains of the labour market. But once again, this is all politically limited because, as I said, I did my PhD on the engineering sector, and that came out of the metal trades. And the vision of the metal trades is that you could go from here up to there. That was the vision, right? You could go from there, lowest skill level, right the way through. What we found, and just as, and this audience will be interested, I told you we did that longitudinal survey of 8,000 workers. because we controlled the data collection, we could actually phone people up. We actually only found 3 people who'd made the transition from the lowest reaches of the labour market up to degree qualified engineer. We actually found 3 of them. We could actually phone them up and say, how did you do it? And all 3 of them said, never advise anyone take this path in life, because it basically destroyed their family lives, because breaking out of these segments is really hard. And if you want to do that, you just don't have a formal career path. You've actually got to have social structures of support. And a key part of that is income support while people diversify their qualifications. But you've also got to have employment arrangements and the definition of jobs which support this. And that's why we say you've got to have communities of trust around these domains, because simply defining it as a formal theoretical opportunity puts a huge burden on the individual to overcome the problems that the structures have left behind. So
that's really interesting, John. In South Africa, we called that from sweeper to engineer, and it also didn't work. It was a policy dream, but exactly as you're saying, and the idea was that you could create that pathway just by changing the qualifications.
Yeah. See, that's why originally my first line of development out of that, because I was a big supporter of that metal worker position, but that's where I did a lot of work around skill ecosystems, because I said, unless you understood the ecosystem within which the skills are developed and deployed, you don't really understand how the formal system functions. And so focusing too much on the formal definition of job classifications, focusing too much on the formal quals misses the point. You've got to look at that total determinant. But as Lisa and I have gone on to say, well, it's not just the ecosystem, it's the community of trust around the domain of expertise. It's the really big issue. Okay.
Thanks, John. That was really interesting. I've got some really interesting questions and comments. One is from Paul, comment from the International Labour Organization. Great that you could join us, Paul. And Paul has got a really interesting comment. He says, great work, John, but I wonder how you reconcile the suggestion for broader, less occupationally specific training with the interest of many individuals, especially at lower skilled levels, to spend as little time as possible in education and training so that they can start working. So I think that's a really interesting one. Then we have a question from Vijen Naidu. And Vijen, I actually put you on I wasn't completely sure what you were asking here, so I'll try it, but I did also put you on giving you speaking rights so that you could put it in your own words if I get it wrong, because I think it would be great to hear from you. So Vijen says, would appreciate a comment from John if there was a link between this research, because I know you mentioned Australia and then you said Germany, Denmark, I can't remember the other country, and different levels of economic development. So is this very much I think what Vijen's asking is, this is very much a wealthy country kind of analysis. But Vijen, please do jump in if you want to add or clarify your question. And then I'm going to go over to Yael Shalem, who's also got a question. And then I've got one more in the Q&A, which we can ask now, or if that's too much, we can pause and come back to it. Over to you, Vijen.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and thank you, John, for this presentation. We have bits and pieces of what you're saying, but I think Stephanie articulated my question the way I phrased it, whether this is located within a particular kind of economy. The challenge in South Africa is, we're dealing with a developing economy, high unemployment rates, and I think it links to the other question or other comment that came in earlier. So I appreciate your comments around the dead end methodologies, but I'm wondering if what you're presenting is medium to long-term strategy, and what would your comment be on a short-term strategy for the situation South Africa finds itself in? Thank you.
Vijen is asking because he has to fix all of the problems in South Africa, you see. So he has to decide what our qualifications are going to look like. in order to actually make a labor market education interface work better. Yael, do you want to come in with your question? You have to unmute yourself. I muted you.
Thanks, John. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you.
I mean, I find it fascinating. I really find the whole research interesting. And I have to start with a qualification that I'm not a labor market researcher. I'm not working in skill formation. I'm coming from a very different area, which is knowledge and curriculum. And if I understand what you're trying to, what your message, your main message is that against those that are saying that in order to be more flexible, we have to teach people more generic skills, you want to keep specialization, you want to develop some form of adaptability. And I'm thinking from a curriculum perspective, what does it mean? So 2 points. One, if I understand your graph, your empirical findings, stronger professions are still managing to more or less move vertically. Am I correct? And horizontally. Now they've got more choices of movement, and they are stronger virtually by the knowledge base of those professions. They can become managers, and they can move to ICT, and even a nurse can move into some clerical jobs. So something in the knowledge base that they've already gained, and the specialization and the experience that they've already gained, allowed them to move horizontally, and the stronger one managed to keep more or less their status by moving or heighten it by moving vertically. So something we have to find out, what is it that allows them, without changing the curriculum, without changing anything, to move because of all those changes in the labor market. That's the one point. So what is it in the current curriculum that allows the stronger to remain strong in those new movements? Not to water down or not to dilute the curriculum in the name of adaptability, because that's a very, very dangerous thing to do. And the second thing is, how do we get people to translate adaptability differently to generic skills? It's a very tricky way to do a curriculum that keeps the knowledge base and give them some of adaptability. You gave an example of a nurse, and you said that she should learn or he should learn the stronger part of her curriculum should be specialization, but we can also teach them clerical work and some sales. It's very difficult to teach how to sell, for example, but clerical work, yeah, I suppose there are some things that, but there's a danger that we're diluting the specialization, or other people will misinterpret your work and increase the space of adaptability at the expense of specialization.
Absolutely.
I think that relates very much to Paul's comment, because the other danger is you just make education too long and too extended for everyone. John, would you like to take one more question, or do you want to, those who were quite substantive?
That's a lot. There's a lot.
Yeah, take those and then we'll come back to the next one.
No, they're terrific questions, and I thank Paul for his question, and that, to just remind people, was about how do you reconcile the interest in upgrading education and expanding it, particularly for people who don't want to be educated or aren't that interested in education. And I think that's a terrific question because as currently structured, the education system is very painful for a lot of people. I remember when one of the deepest insights I got from a project was one of my colleagues came back from interviewing a teacher. We were talking about the reforms to the labour market around the engineering model. And the teacher had said, the problem is, this is back in the 90s in Australia, the problem is we still haven't worked out what to do with the bottom 80%. Right, so that's basically telling you the education system is really good at looking after the top 20%, but we really haven't figured out what to do with the bottom 80%. And she wasn't celebrating this, but I thought that is a nice way of putting it. And for me, and once again, as Yale pointed out, my ideas can be completely misrepresented and taken over, but when I think about education and training, I'm a labour market researcher. It's not just about schools. It's not just about universities. It's not just about TVET institutions. It's about the work itself. It's about work being a site of learning. But the problem is most workplaces aren't up to it. And so I think when we're thinking in policy terms is how do we help those employers who are capable of creating really strong domains for learning skill. And you see elements of this in the apprenticeship system. In Australia, we've got quite a strong apprenticeship system, but it's really only the top 30 to 40% of employers who are really good. And I think we should be thinking about how do we support that top 30 to 40% and get them to expand their places. So totally alive to your issue, Paul. I'm not saying keep them all on at school longer. On the contrary, my view is how do we get a quality system of on-the-job training up? And that's a big question, and is open to massive abuse because every employer in the country will put their hand up and say, yep, I'm going to train them and I'll take that public money. And the example I cite there is in the health system, not every hospital is a teaching hospital. And I'd say in the labour market, not every workplace is a learning workplace. And so we need to develop systems which support and recognise good learning workplaces. That's, I think, the response to Paul. Good question. Is this, then the second question was around, is this a wealthy country analysis as opposed to one where there's a developing country analysis? Yes, I mean, it's come out of the Australian experience. I compared the situation with Denmark and Germany, but I did also give you the example from agriculture, and I gave you that example of rural operations, and I think that is relevant no matter what the degree of development. And that's actually looking at how you can use agricultural work as a site for giving people a broad range of skills, you know, not just being a dairy hand, you know, not just being an unskilled cropper or whatever. It's actually looking at, when we talk to the people in ag, you know, to actually, they need people who understand basic soil science, who understand basic hydraulics and what water flows, people who understand basic machinery and mechanics. That idea of a rural operator is what you would call a certificate in Australia, Certificate 3, roughly trades level. And that's really starting to rethink agricultural work. But your killer point is, and this is something Stephanie and I wrote about for UNESCO last year, the overwhelming problem in not just in the developing world, but also in the developed world now is underemployment. And we've got to recognise that in a situation of chronic oversupply of labour, there are going to be major problems that the education system just cannot fix. If the society does not prioritise elevating the level of labour demand, and educators shouldn't say we can step in there and solve that. So I'm talking about quality skills. It's better to maintain the integrity of your skills system and say we cannot solve unemployment. A better educated workforce will not solve unemployment. Right? Look at Spain, you know, look at Greece. They've got massively skilled populations, grossly underemployed. And so the analysis can be extended to a developing country. But like I say, have a look at the paper that Steph and I wrote for UNESCO, because everything we say is subject to, we've got to be realistic. If the labour demand isn't there, the skill system can't fix it. But let's look at where the skill system can make a difference, and it's in this area of quality capabilities and particularly quality occupations. And that leads into Yale's outstanding question. So Yale says she's from curriculum and she doesn't understand labour markets. She's hit the nail absolutely on the head. It's the unresolved issue in this analysis. And that's why I said my primary area of research expertise now is what is the future of expertise? Because I'm strongly of the view that everyone's got to have a domain of expertise that is coherent and allows them to be fully functioning in a particular domain. Now, the question is, what is that domain? And you've picked up really nicely that on one reading of my analysis, that could be massive skills dilution. Like in care work, let's get rid of the nurses and let's just have a modern services worker who can move between care, clerical and customer service. That is a risk. My answer to that risk is that I think, and that's why I took you through, let me just show you the thing again. In this slide, I think if we say there are these different flows, vocational streams within modern service work, within each of these, there should be a core. So the core of these ones should be care. The core of these ones should be clerical. You know, the core of these ones should be, say, customer service. I think there's actually you've got to maintain a coherent core. And you see that in Australia, we used to have a collection by the Bureau of Statistics here called the Careers of People with Trades Qualifications. And it showed that many people started off life, say, as a carpenter or as a metal fitter and machinist, but later in life didn't work as a carpenter or as a metal fitter and machinist, but they'd learned how to think and read blueprints. They'd learned how to take that theoretical knowledge and apply it in the real world. And it was that capacity which they could then take away from construction or take away from engineering and use that in a broader domain of life. But they had an anchoring of it in a domain of expertise. And so I think your instinct is exactly right there. We've got to keep those specialised domains, but we've got to somehow figure out how we build up an adjacent capacity around it. And that's just to reiterate what I said with respect to Binjan's observation. The skill system can only go so far on that. If you've got a situation of chronic over-labour supply, employers can just be completely opportunistic in the way in which they appropriate skills. And so we can't control that. The best education can do is actually argue for coherence along the lines you were doing. And I think that's a very important principle to maintain. So I think, yep, you're asking the right questions, and I don't have a simple answer, but for me, I'm trying to find a way which is responding to the challenge of the WEF and its 21st century skills agenda without retreating into, let's just go back to specialised occupations as we used to have them. That's what's driving me. And I think you can only solve that ultimately practically. You've got to have that community of trust coming together. And that's why there's a strong political dimension of this, not just an analytical one. Is that okay, Yael? That's as far as I can get. Okay.
Thanks, John. I've got another 3 difficult questions. We're really making you work today and late at night for you, John.
Yeah, sure.
One from Glenn Fisher, who says, is there space in your focus on building the capabilities for adaptation as opposed to linear skills planning for skills anticipation, i.e. anticipating what future skills might look like, for example, technological and economic change, but also in terms of government, economic strategy or industrial strategy? So I guess Glenn is saying, are you completely abandoning skills anticipation or not? Then I've got Jocelyn Vass, who is from our Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, and also a PhD student at the Real Centre, who says, I'm wondering if this analysis does not just formalize an existing mode of multi-skilled work, especially among low to mid-skilled workers. Jocelyn, if you want to comment further on that, I can.
I understand exactly what's being said. No,
yeah,
I understand.
I think it's quite a hard-hitting question. Yes. And then we have Robin Ann Ferguson, who says, thank you for a clear and stimulating presentation. How do you expect the growing trend of digital nomads, accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic, will impact labor market in the countries and cities around the world which have actively sought to attract such nomads? So I think that's 3 interesting questions. Back to you, John.
Okay. No, they're great questions. Is there no role for foresight and planning? That's actually a really good one. Look, I suppose what I'd say there is you want to keep that in perspective. Like, too many people say too much. We should put more emphasis on the so-called skills for the future, you know, more data science. You know, I managed the data science unit in the business school for 5 years. So I've been right at the pointy end of managing that demand in skills. And when you get down to what employers want in that area is that they don't just want somebody with the data science skills. Like, I saw some students and some great staff. They were fantastic machine learners. You know, they were great, you know, Bayesian statisticians who were right across all the programming as well. But they couldn't actually analyze the problem that was in front of them. And this is where I think that deeper problem-solving capability is something that comes from broader pursuits. So, for instance, some of the best data scientists I ran across were trained in physics. And so you wouldn't say physics is a skill that's in short supply, because the world's got a surfeit of physicists, because, you know, people have got a curiosity about that part of the world. And so I think, yes, and Stephanie and I have talked about this, for the core of the education system, I think you've got to give people a solid grounding in the capacity for independent reasoning, but that's got to be supported by supplementary top-up skills. This is where I do think there is a role for micro-credentials, not as a substitute for core skills, but as a complement. And I think when you're doing your labour force planning, you look out across the population, you say, what are the underlying capabilities we're going to need? You're going to have to, there's going to have to be some basic engineering. There's going to have to be some basic, you know, arts and humanities capability. There's going to have to be some, you know, basic business skills. But let's not get too prescriptive. Let people develop their specialisms and their capacity for independent thought out of that, and then have supplementary work that's meeting the more immediate needs. And going back to Paul's question, sometimes that supplementary work will sometimes be best done in the workplace. And I think we should be looking at getting integrated programs where there's training on the job that rounds things out. Just give my example. For example, I did a history degree and a law degree and ended up in the public service. But the first year I was in there, they taught me how to write, you know, because they taught me how to write, you know, really complex ideas in a page. And that's something that I could really only learn in the workplace. Similarly, with a lot of the data science stuff, some of the best applications actually aren't codified yet and can often only be learned in the workplace. So I think the way to solve that problem is you've got to segment your education system into the underpinning deeper skills, and then having the capacity to top up over time. Now, the second question was, in fact, the withering question for the night, and the one where I will dissolve on the spot, because isn't this really formalising de facto multi-skilling in the lower reaches of the labour market? That's like the 10 out of 10 question for the evening, because that's exactly what's going on. And I have, because people would say, well, maybe the segments of the problem. They're not the solution. We should be thinking, and that was the aspiration of the metal workers in Australia, where they said you should be able to go from cleaner to degree qualified engineer. That aspiration is still sound. What I suppose I'm trying to find out is, how can we think about flows within this area more? Because there wasn't enough thought of flows. It was more linear progression. And so my only defence would be, we've got to get a better handle on reality. And my analysis is very much, what's the current reality? The question from your colleague there is, well, maybe reality is the problem, and we should be raising our ambition. And to that, I think that's exactly right. And that's why I would say, we need to have a debate. What are the domains of expertise we want? That's a debate. And my fear in that area at the moment is that that's being colonised by big tech. Big tech's running around saying what the future of expertise is. Well, I couldn't think of any group less qualified to answer that question. And I think it's, people who think more broadly who should be answering it. But yep, no, that was the question of the evening. As for digital nomads, look, you're really right. You're right. I'm right at the edge of my knowledge. It's not something I'm au fait with. There are people in my discipline back in the business school who are in that area. My only defence on that one is that I think they're overplayed as a proportion of the workforce. That's the one thing I would say about my analysis here, is that it does give us the capacity to keep things in proportion. There's an awful lot of people in here, right? There's still a bucketload of blue collar people. So there'll be some digital nomads sprinkled through there. There'll be some digital nomads sprinkled through there. But from a labour market perspective, the big blocks are in these categories. So I'm sorry, that's just sidestepping, and I can't answer it directly, but I just can't be across everything. Just got to be honest on that one.
Thanks, John. I mean, I think this expertise versus multi-skilling, broad versus narrow, is the kind of central issue. Because, in South Africa, we've been looking at, in our original qualifications framework that we adopted in '94, we ended up with really, really highly specialized, very narrow focused qualifications. We've been trying to move away from that. So, for example, I don't know if Jen can comment, but at one point we had something like 40 electrician qualifications, which is really the opposite of what you're talking about here, John. So I guess,
that's really interesting that you point that, because one of your colleagues said, is this a long run strategy or is this a short run strategy? And I didn't answer that point. And we have looked at the short run strategy. And what we've done is I've shown you the clustering of labour market flows. What we've also done is the clustering of qualifications, because the one advantage, the only advantage of a competency-based training system is that it does fragment and atomise skills, but using modern text analytics, you can then cluster those. And so what we've done, like Australia's got, I think, 3,000 separate vocational quals. You can use text analytics to start to cluster those. So you say you've got 40 different quals for an electrician. What we've been able to say is you don't just wrap them together as a modern electrician. You can actually look across and say, well, is that also got spillover into mechatronics? Has it got spillover into some parts of construction? So this is where I think modern data science is a tool. It's not an answer, but it's a tool for being able to re-aggregate and see patterns that are latent that most people don't see.
Really interesting. I don't know if Jen, when you were combining the electrician qualifications, if you used that at all, if you want to comment. But I was just saying that I guess that's the key issue. How do you maintain a notion of expertise at the same time as broadening what you're preparing people to work in? I think that's a really fascinating question, and I think that you've put some ideas on the table that could help us start thinking about how to do that. There's a chat going on. There's a discussion going on in the chat, which is about one very specific type of workplace, which is universities.
Yes.
And the phenomenon of administrative staff who have recently started moving upways or sideways, particularly into academic areas that up till now they have been supporting by starting to actually access education at the universities where they're doing admin work. So I don't know if you want to if you want to comment on that. Simon McGrath commented that he's got a PhD student who is a registrar doing a PhD on academic admin relations, and they're trying to get a handle on clusters within higher education admin in terms of qualifications, role types, etc. So I think that's a quite interesting kind of possibly very introspective, as many of us are academics in the seminar, but nonetheless an interesting as a rather large workplace in modern economies.
But once again, see, the question I'd be looking at there is, what are the common problems you have? So it's not just universities. You've got modern knowledge service work, you know, the big consultancies, they're big social research outfits now that require that kind of high level admin and professional expertise. The health system needs high level, you know, professional and organisational support. So I think it's a great question, but I wouldn't just confine it to universities. I'd be looking at what's the potential transferability of that capability into other domains, particularly health and professional services. Because you probably, you know, and I'm surprised no one's picked it up yet, what's actually driving me behind all of this is a loyalty to the old vision of occupations as empowering workers vis-a-vis managers, right? If you have skills that are transferable, you give people choices if they fall out with their current manager. If skills are too narrowly defined and you're tied up in a particular industry and a particular employer, that weakens Labor's bargaining power. If Labor can have a domain of expertise that it can take to a variety of areas, you then enhance its ability to have more control. That's where I'm coming from, and that's in answer to that question. You just don't want to have the best admin and organisational support in a higher education system. You want, in Australia at the moment, we're kind of shaping up for a big fallout. You know, there's been problems with the funding model. So you want to give those people the capacity to adapt rapidly if they move, if higher ed does have a big shakeout.
Yeah, really interesting. I think we are approaching the end of our time, John, and I know that it's late in the evening for you. I'm sure you want to knock off from a long day's work. So I mean, I think that the questions and comments raised really show how important this work is. And we are definitely going to be coming back to you, John, on a range of different things that we're working on, both in terms of the analysis and the kind of conceptual issues, and also in terms of the policy side, because these are just issues that we're really struggling with in the South African qualification system and occupational classification system. So I think you've really given us a lot to think about, a lot of analytic tools, a lot of new ideas. And I think what I really like about your approach is that it just gets us away from, as you say, this kind of really tedious dead end about skills mismatches and, you know, all these kind of things that are constantly lamented and never seem to get better and never seem to go anywhere. And it's really just saying, let's think about this all differently. And maybe then we'll actually start making some progress.
Absolutely.
So that was really, really useful. Yeah. Let's have your last words before we end.
Every one of those questions was spot on. That, you know, you gave me a really hard time, and that's really good. You've got a great group around you, Stephanie, and your team there. I mean, I've given this presentation in a number of places and I haven't got nearly as hard a time, which I think is a really good sign. No, when I visited South Africa, I was incredibly impressed with the quality of the debate there. So thanks for letting me in. Thanks for respecting me, but boy, you're starting from a very high base over there, and I look forward to staying in touch. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, John. We really, really appreciate your time, especially given what time of day it is for you. And we really look forward to taking it further. Palesa or Prisha, are you going to do you have any closing words?
Well, just a big thank you. I thought it was a stimulating presentation. You know, you walked us through it so systematically. And I really, really enjoyed it. It was thought-provoking. I loved what Simon brought in at the end about universities. it's great to know that I can move horizontally if I need to, you know, have like a slight career change. But yeah, I thought it was brilliant. Thank you so, so much. And Twitter loved it.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
no,
look forward to
just
starting- Sorry.
yeah, no, just also say thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. We'll see you on the 11th of August for the next seminar.
Great.
Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Cheers, everyone.
All right.